Hello, I'm Jeffrey K. Mondello, editor of the Boston Catholic Journal. Today, let us talk about what the Church calls custody of the eyes. As you may know, it is not spoken of much, if you hear it at all in today's Church, although it was something that was known and understood by, that is to say, something that was taught to, generations of Catholics, especially Catholic men, before the sexual revolution of the 60s and the Vatican II Church's culpable silence in the face of that disastrous unfolding, that unraveling of a once Christian culture, both here and in Europe, the consequences of which we continue to experience today, and ever more extreme expressions of sexual perversity. In teaching us about keeping custody of the eyes, the Church said effectively, if you would keep your soul, keep custody of your eyes. What did she mean by that? And why do we hear no longer about it? First, we must understand that images have a way of burning themselves into remembrance. Much as one who has looked long and closely at a visual pattern or a bright image still sees an image of them when he closes his eyes, a phenomenon called after-image or image burning. Long after we have seen things, their image remains burned into memory, almost akin to a permanent retinal scar looking too long into the sun. Even as the thing seen is no longer present to sight, or no longer exists, it still affects our vision, superimposes upon it something that was once seen and is present no longer, but somehow cannot be unseen. Even as we look upon other images, most of us have experienced this phenomenon, and it passes. But this, we realize, pertains to the physical, the sensory apparatus of our bodies, particularly to the anatomy of the eye, the optic nerve, the cornea, the retina, etc. Beyond the merely anatomical vision, the word images is particularly apropos of a discussion of the Catholic concept of custody of the eyes. Because what we look at most intently and most often are other people, people who are created in imago Dei, that is to say, in the image of God. Paradoxically, in this very act of seeing, it is precisely this image that we fail to see when we do not exercise custody of the eyes. Rather, we focus, and that is the key word, focus, an active intentionality. That is to say, a willing and intentional act of focusing on the outward appearance that conceals this image of God, and under which it lies unchanging, even as the veil of the flesh ages, withers, and dies. In a word, we look upon bodies, and not simply upon bodies, but upon bodies to the exclusion of their souls, those visually inaccessible images of God in which the substance of their created being unchangeably exists, even as the physical habitat embodying it decays and disappears. We must come to understand that we cannot unsee what we have seen. Please impress this upon your minds. We cannot unsee what we have seen. If you consider this carefully, it is really a very frightening realization. We cannot unmake, erase, or otherwise expunge from memory the images that we have allowed our eyes to see. We can suppress them, and even for a time forget them, but they will remain withal in that vast repository of experiences that is summarized in what we call our memory. It is a repository with locking gates that open inwardly only, and through which passage is always in and never out, an almost inexhaustible deposit that is ever accruing and from which nothing can be discarded, no matter how useless or even harmful. Our eyes are those gates. Through them, what we have seen enters and is kept for the rest of our lives. Once we have carelessly allowed our eyes to see something, especially something of our intentional choosing, and most especially if we subsequently find it detrimental to our happiness, we cannot, for all our efforts, open the gates to expel it. We cannot choose to unsee it. This is precisely why we must keep custody of our eyes. Just as our hands only touch what we want them to touch, so our eyes only see what we want them to see. We are not speaking, of course, of what we cannot avoid seeing or what we commonly see in our everyday activities. Most often these are things that we don't willfully choose to see, but come to us in our everyday experiences. Nature around us, structures built by men, the furnishings that surround us in our homes and our offices. I'm speaking of what we choose to see and linger upon. In other words, the seeing that involves the conscious choice of the will. There are two distinct categories at play here, to which we must pay careful attention concerning custody of the eyes. One leads to sin and unhappiness, and one leads from sin to unhappiness. The first involves the sin of lust, and the second, the sin of pride. Both are deadly, and both lead to unhappiness. The first involves avoiding the occasion of the sin of lust. You know what I'm talking about. The glance that lingers for that fraction of a second longer that separates a mere perception from a willful act. The glance that passes from mere recognition to illicit interest, from acknowledgement to invitation. The glance that is really the unstated question, are you interested in me? You see that I am interested in you. It is unmistakable, and you know it. What is more, the other knows it too, and will either recoil from you or cooperate with you. It transforms a casual encounter into something briefly intimate, from the occasion of sin to the invitation to sin. In an instant, we communicate our willingness to cooperate in sin with the other. Our imagination is stirred, What does her body look like beneath her clothing? Is she likely an adroit lover? The imagination leaves no part of her body unravished, untouched. And in a split second, you have undressed her, explored her, caressed her, and had sex with her. If one of the two in this encounter is virtuous, or simply not interested, they will deflect the glance to something else or simply ignore it altogether. The problem, however, is that we have already sinned. We know it. They know it. Almighty God knows it. But we pretend that because the glance was so brief and in vain, we have not sinned. But that is not what Christ tells us. He said, "Whoever shall look upon a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." This is custody of the eyes, paying attention to what one willfully sees, to what we open our eyes to what we linger upon. And because the sin to which the eyes most readily lend themselves is that of lust, the desire for sexual intimacy and sensual gratification through the other, custody of the eyes is the most effective means to that beautiful virtue of holy chastity. The two are inseparable. We only come to desire what we see with the eyes. And for that reason, it is paramount that the Catholic keep custody of his eyes, holding them in abeyance to his will, not allowing them to wander wantonly upon all things that present themselves, but carefully choosing what he allows himself to see intentionally and willfully, knowing his weakness and proclivity to sin, and that the avenue to sin always begins with the eyes. And now, to avoid the occasion of the sin of pride, custody of the eyes and the sin of pride, what am I talking about? We lust as much for knowledge in the mind as we lust for sensuous gratification in the body. We want to know everything. From the beginning, it has been thrust upon us that all knowledge is good, that he who knows more is superior to one who knows less. We esteem those who know the most and disdain those who know the least. Indeed, it is a matter of pride to possess more of anything, especially knowledge, yes? He then who knows most would be far superior to those who know less. Indeed, the closer he moves to the total acquisition of knowledge, the closer, we believe, he comes to human perfection, and therefore happiness. Right? Those who would have you believe this, that all knowledge, regardless of what, is good, are both foolish and dangerous. Do you doubt it? Remember that the fall of our first parents, Adam and Eve, was predicated upon the false promise of the fullness of knowledge as the greatest possible good. I'd like to quote here from Genesis, the book of Genesis, chapter 3. "And the serpent said to the woman, 'No, you shall not die the death. For God knows that in the day that you shall eat of it, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil Your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. Keep that in mind, knowing good and evil. Too late they learned that not all knowledge is good and beneficial. The consequence we know was death, suffering, and misery, not only for Adam and Eve, but for all their posterity through the sad patrimony of original sin, passing from generation to generation. Not all knowledge, we find, is good and beneficial after all. Do you doubt it still? Let us suppose that we genuinely sought to know all things, thinking ourselves surely to be better for it. After all, to know is better than not to know, right? To know is to be among the learned, and not to know is to be among the ignorant. And who wishes to be accounted ignorant, right? Apart from analytical propositions, for example, logical propositions and mathematical equations that always resolve themselves into conclusions already implicit within and derived from premises already stated, most of our knowledge is empirical. That is to say, it's derived from sensory experience. To say that we know something is really saying that we have experienced something and are therefore acquainted with it. We do not know mathematical propositions in the same way we know the fragrance of a rose. We cannot know that fragrance analytically in the way that we know that the square root of 4 is 2. We must experience it. Let's look at a better analogy. To one who is color deficient and has never seen the color purple, every attempt to help such a person analytically arrive at purple through invoking the science of chromatics, the visible color spectrum, or the graphic designer's use of RGB or hex color codes fails miserably. He is unable to experience the color purple because of defective retinal cones in his eyes, and nothing short of the experience of the color purple will suffice. Only upon experiencing purple will he be able to say that he knows purple. Now, this is a very benign paradigm. I think it likely that the color-deficient man would find it beneficial to actually experience the color purple. A garden of flowers would be all the more beautiful for the greater multiplicity of colors. Certainly, to one whose perception is deficient in both yellow and red, a clear and distinguishable acquaintance with each would be decidedly beneficial while approaching traffic lights. Such knowledge redounds to both his happiness and, well, his safety and that of others. But there are other paradigms as well. Consider our acquaintance with other types of experience that would qualify us as knowing certain things, and see, in light of them, if we still maintain the proposition that all knowledge is good and beneficial. In order to do this, however, we must be prepared to accept the fact, and this is what is crucial, that our subsequent knowledge of them will remain with us and that we will be unable to unknow them once we have acquired knowledge of them. You will probably know more than you presently know. And whether you deem this as having redounded to your happiness and well-being, no, only you will be able to decide that afterward. But the preponderance of the likelihood that such knowledge will be detrimental to both your happiness and well-being is of the highest order of probability. This is not for the faint-hearted. Be forewarned. If you nevertheless adamantly hold that all knowledge is good and beneficial to us, then continue, even as I discourage you to. To proceed is pride and arrogance, and the foul fruit of it will be commensurable with both. After serious consideration, I've decided, for your sake, to include nothing graphic relating to the types of knowledge readily available to us concerning things that we could learn about in depth or visually experience that would add to the sum of our knowledge, even as it would diminish our happiness, or at least our peace of mind. Instead, I will leave it to your imagination and allow you to decide if acquiring such knowledge will be good for you and redound to your happiness because it redounds to your knowledge. Such topics would include, among many, many others, body farms, microscopic bacteria on our skin, the procedures and tools of forensic pathologists, dust mites, mortuary practices and procedures, autopsies, necrophilia, necrophagia, to mention a few. Our learning of such things would surely accrue to the sum of our knowledge, but with equal certainty would not accrue to our happiness. Upon learning of them, we would, after little thought, rather that we had never known them. Our limited world of knowledge would be a decidedly happier place for us, but sadly, once known, such things cannot be unknown. What we choose to acquire in knowledge, we sometimes purchase at the cost of happiness. In a word, what we allow into our minds, what we choose to let into our minds, is of vital importance and will directly affect our happiness, both our natural happiness in this life and even, perhaps, our supernatural happiness in the life to come. The latter, especially concerning the acquaintance, the knowledge and experience with witchcraft, Satan worship, occult practices, and the like, and its detrimental effect on our moral and spiritual lives, we need not elaborate upon. Am I then suggesting that ignorance is bliss? Of course not. Only the most superficial understanding would lend itself to this brainless conclusion. Our present reflection, both in meaning and tenor, is not to denigrate education. A properly educated man is an asset in every way, both to himself and to those around him. I hasten to add that education is not to be confused with possessing diplomas or degrees. I know too many men with both who possess far less knowledge than some who have neither. Sadly, we need forensic pathologists, morticians, and epidemiologists, to name a few. What we do not need is indiscriminate knowledge. Knowledge of everything and anything. This is neither possible nor, as we have seen, desirable. In the end, it is the custody of our eyes, what we allow, permit, what we will to see, and as a consequence to know, that is really the most vigilant guardian of both our happiness in this life and our redemption in Christ, that culminates in the total felicity of our souls in the next. I would also hasten to add that it is extremely unlikely that the educated man will find his erudition of any use whatever in heaven, or of any avail in hell. I suspect that the latter is more populated than the former with men and women of extraordinary academic credentials, simple souls who know less and love more are far more likely to enter the kingdom of heaven. In the way of keeping custody of your eyes, you are exercising your will. You either will to do or you will not to do. I cannot emphasize this sufficiently. When confronted with the temptation to sin, the fully conscious words, the statement deliberately made within oneself, "I will not," is both an act and an intention. These are two separate movements in the rational soul. The intention precedes the act. You either intend or do not intend to act. And when the rational soul decides which, it will then act upon the intention or not. The exercise of the disciplined will against the unruly and undisciplined desires is nothing less than attaining to mastery of yourself. "I will to" is a powerful and manly antidote to "I yearn for." It is also very much a corollary to the injunction to avoid the occasion of sin, the person, the place, or the thing most likely to lead you into sin. You know what that is for you, and so does God. He will give you the grace to avoid sin. God keep you.